The last time I saw Nolan was 3 o'clock. Pause on those words. Because later, in that same interview, Warren Hudson describes something else. He describes Nolan near the boat. He describes Nolan being with Katie. He describes the group preparing to leave. And suddenly, one simple question appears. How did Warren know that? That is the moment a former Army interrogator zeroed in on. Not Warren's facial expression. Not whether he looked nervous. Not whether his eyes moved somewhere. Something much harder to explain away. His own words. And right now, that matters. Because more than a month later, Nolan Wells's death remains unresolved. The independent autopsy did not establish a definitive cause or manner of death. No one has been charged. No one has been publicly named a suspect. And just this week, the Congressional Black Caucus asked the Justice Department for a federal review. The Justice Department says that request is being reviewed. So forget the internet rumors. Forget the fake arrest posts. Forget people declaring this case solved. Today, we're doing something much narrower. We're looking at Warren's actual interview. What he said, when he said it. And the question an experienced interrogator says the interviewer should have immediately asked. Because if Warren simply misspoke, there may be an innocent explanation. But if those statements cannot coexist, then investigators need to know why. And that distinction is everything. This is not about proving Warren guilty. There is no public evidence establishing that. This is about something more basic.
I am a former Army interrogator, human intelligence collector. I was trained by the United States government to analyze your language, body language, posture to identify deception. I did it in the real world through interrogations, through source operations, and through strategic debriefings. I've got tons of certifications. I'm an expert at this.
You guys get ready to leave out of there, getting towed out.
Yeah.
And then where's Nolan in this situation?
Well, Nolan was, the last time I saw Nolan was 3 o'clock.
Last time he saw Nolan was 3 o'clock. That is critically important information. Right here, he's talking about when his buddy Bart pulls out his buddy Wyatt's boat. So Bart is on one boat and he's pulling out Wyatt's boat. Wyatt's boat is the one that you've heard about was taken on water and sinking, and that's why they had to leave Horn Island. I want you to pay attention to this.
To where we're out of all this, all this chaos, because we left at 4:30 and there was still.
We left at 4:30. We left at 4:30. This guy just said that the last time he saw Nolan was 3 o'clock. Very specific time. Now, how did he know it was 3 o'clock? Brandon Tatum didn't ask him that. If this was an interrogation, that's a key question I would ask. How do you know it was 3 o'clock?
And then where's Nolan in this situation?
Well, Nolan was, the last time I saw Nolan was 3 o'clock.
3 o'clock.
And Nolan was cradling a girl in his arms, Katie. Katie.
That's Katie McCormick that he's talking about. Katie McCormick said that's not true, but let's listen. This is at 3 o'clock. This happened at 3 o'clock.
And Nolan was sitting there, and the last time I saw him, I looked at Nolan, and Nolan was like shaking his head, laughing. That was the last time I laid eyes on him. But when we were leaving,
well, when we were leaving, so it would be 4:30, because he's already said we were leaving at 4:30.
Nolan was sitting by the boat.
Nolan was sitting by the boat. How do you know, Warren, that Nolan was sitting by the boat? The last time you laid eyes on him was at 3 o'clock. It's now 4:30. This is your timeline. Timeline is everything. At this part of the story, he's at 4:30. But he just said less than a minute ago, 2 minutes ago, that the last time he saw Nolan was 3 o'clock.
Nolan was sitting by the boat with that Katie girl, and
how do you know that? The last time you laid eyes, your exact words, on him was 3 o'clock. You're now talking about 4:30. Now listen what happens next.
my buddy yelled for Nolan, get on the boat. We're leaving.
Now, in the interest of honest analysis here, if they were both on the boat and he heard his buddy yelling at Nolan, not him, by the way. Warren wasn't yelling at Nolan. Even in his own story, he wasn't looking for Nolan or yelling for Nolan. And in the beginning of part one of the interview, He says, Nolan was like a brother to me. He was my best friend. More than a friend, though. He was like a brother to me. But Warren's not the one looking for Nolan, not the one yelling for Nolan. He don't even go over and lay eyes on him again, according to his own story that he's telling us. But he hears his buddy saying, hey, Nolan.
The boat's having issues. And like, no, he didn't say that, but he was panicking. Nolan, get the F on the boat. Get on the boat. And Nolan said, no, I'm staying out here. I'm going to ride in with somebody else. And it's not uncommon to hear. It's not like my buddy asked him one time. My buddy asked Nolan multiple times to get on.
So your buddy asked Nolan multiple times and you never did. Your brother, your best friend. But notice he didn't say Nolan said, I'm going to stay here with Katie who I'm sitting with next to the boat. No part of that exchange would have given Warren the details to know that Nolan was sitting by the boat with Katie, which was his exact words. He contradicted himself. That's blatant deception and needs to be immediately exploited and interrogated.
Can the account withstand careful questioning? Because listen again. Warren tells interviewer Brandon Tatum that his final personal sighting of Nolan was around 3 in the afternoon. According to Warren's account, Nolan was with a young woman. He remembers the moment clearly enough to describe Nolan laughing. He remembers joking with him. Then Warren says his attention shifted. He says somebody alerted him that his younger brother was fighting. Warren says he ran toward that situation. Afterward, attention moved toward the boat. There was a serious mechanical problem. The bilge pump was failing. Water was entering the vessel. Everyone's focus, Warren says, changed. That part is important. Because Warren's explanation is essentially this. There was confusion. There was urgency. People were trying to leave safely. And Nolan made his own decision to remain behind with the young woman. That is Warren's account. And to be fair to him, parts of that account are independently supported. There really was a boat emergency. The Mississippi Department of Marine Resources later released the sea tow call. On that recording, a young caller says the bilge pump has stopped working. He reports that the boat is sinking. The dispatcher asks about those aboard. The caller says everyone aboard is okay. Coordinates are provided near Horn Island. So the mechanical problem was real. That is not merely Warren's story. And that distinction matters. Good investigation is not choosing sides. You separate what can be verified from what currently depends on testimony. Boat problem? Documented. Large 4th of July gathering? Documented. Warren speaking publicly about Nolan? Documented. Warren saying Nolan decided to remain? That is Warren's account. Whether everything happened exactly that way is still part of the investigation. Now here is where things tighten. Warren says he personally last saw Nolan at about 3 o'clock. That statement establishes a boundary. Not for the entire case, for Warren's own first-hand knowledge. Think about that distinction. If I tell you, I last saw someone at 3, then anything I describe after 3 must come from somewhere. Maybe somebody told me. Maybe I heard it happening. Maybe I saw something from far away. Maybe I learned it afterward. All of those are possible, but they are different from personally witnessing something. That is exactly why investigators separate first-hand knowledge from second-hand knowledge. And during Warren's account of the boat leaving, he describes Nolan's location with surprising specificity. The former Army interrogator reviewing this focused on that exact point. He argues that Warren's earlier statement places his final sighting around 3. Yet Warren later speaks as though he knows where Nolan was positioned while the group was preparing to depart. The phrase that drew attention was essentially, Nolan was sitting near the boat with Katie. Notice this. The important issue is not whether Warren looked uncomfortable. The issue is knowledge. Where did that information come from? The interrogator's criticism was straightforward. If Warren did not see Nolan again, what supplied those specific details? Was somebody else describing Nolan? Did Warren hear the exchange? Was Warren close enough to observe it? Or did he actually see Nolan again? That is the follow-up question the expert says should have come immediately. Instead, the interview keeps moving, and that lost follow-up matters. Because Warren's broader explanation contains another important distinction. He says one of his friends, not necessarily Warren himself, was calling toward Nolan. According to Warren, that friend repeatedly told Nolan to board. Warren says Nolan declined. Again, that statement is not proof that Warren personally watched the exchange. He could have heard it. He could have been told afterward. He could have been nearby. That is precisely the point. We do not know. And when the record does not tell us, we should not pretend it does. But neither should an interviewer leave that uncertainty untouched. That is where the ex-interrogator's analysis becomes useful. Not as a guilty verdict, as a question generator. He calls the apparent contradiction significant. His view is that an interrogator would stop right there. You said 3 o'clock. Now you're describing a later scene. How do you know? Who told you? When did they tell you? Where exactly were you standing? Could you physically see Nolan? Did you hear Nolan answer? Who heard that answer with you? Those questions could resolve this quickly. Maybe Warren has simple answers. If he does, that matters too. Because contradiction and deception are not automatically the same thing. People misremember. People compress events. People retell something they learned later as part of one continuous story. Traumatic memories can also become disorganized. And professional interviewing guidance warns against declaring someone deceptive based simply on behavior. Even experienced investigators can make mistakes reading people. The FBI itself has cautioned that visible discomfort is not proof of lying. Modern investigative interview guidance also warns against relying on behavioral cues alone. So when you hear somebody say, "He looked away," "He touched his face," "He paused too long," be careful. None of that proves anything. But factual inconsistency is different. Factual inconsistency can be tested. That is why this moment matters. You do not need to interpret Warren's face. You can compare statement against statement, and then ask for the missing bridge. Think about what that means. If Warren's final sighting truly happened around 3 o'clock, then we need the source for everything he knew afterward. If the information came from another friend, identify that friend. If Warren heard Nolan speaking, explain where Warren was. If Warren could see him, then 3 o'clock was not his final sighting. There may be an explanation, but the question has to be asked. And something else makes this important. Warren is not describing a stranger. In his interviews, he calls Nolan extremely close. He describes him like a brother. He says they had known each other since around 8th grade. He says they spoke frequently. That means Warren's understanding of Nolan's behavior carries weight. But it also creates another question. What did Warren understand Nolan's plan to be? Not what everybody assumes now. What did Warren know then? Warren's explanation is that Nolan wanted to remain with the young woman. And according to Warren, Nolan intended to return another way. But Nolan's parents strongly dispute that this sounded like their son. Their objection is not forensic evidence. It does not prove Warren wrong. Parents cannot know every decision an 18-year-old makes. But their objection explains why investigators cannot simply accept the statement without testing it. Nolan's father has repeatedly said he taught his children something simple. Go with a group. Return with that group. His parents also question why Nolan would intentionally remain without his phone. And now we reach the phone. Because this is where Warren's interview stops being an isolated media appearance. The phone may independently test parts of these competing accounts. Warren has publicly said leaving phones aboard boats was normal. Saltwater. Swimming. People drinking. Phones get destroyed. So people protect them. That explanation is plausible on its face. But Nolan's family raises a more specific question. Protecting the phone while swimming is one thing. Leaving the island without Nolan, while Nolan's phone leaves with everyone else, is something different. Again, separate the questions. Was it normal to store phones? One question. Was Nolan intentionally staying behind? Another question. If he knowingly stayed behind, did he understand his phone was leaving without him? Another question. Who possessed it afterward? Another question. Was anything deleted? Another question. And crucially, What can a forensic extraction actually recover? That question is still alive. In fact, as of August 14th, it has become one of the newest disputes in this investigation. The family and district attorney previously agreed to a coordinated examination. The plan involved forensic specialists from both sides. Possible FBI involvement was discussed, but according to correspondence released by the family's legal team, the examination still has not happened. The family says no examination date had ever been jointly set. Then on August 12th, the district attorney's office requested that the phone be delivered by the morning of August 14th. The family says they were out of state. Their lawyers are asking first for an agreed forensic protocol. That includes chain of custody, how the extraction will be preserved, who receives the extracted data, and how the device is returned. The family says it remains willing to conduct the joint examination. Think about where that leaves us. A public interview contains a potentially testable inconsistency. A phone may contain data relevant to Nolan's communications. The phone examination remains unresolved. The official state autopsy is complete, but has not been publicly released. The independent autopsy could not determine cause or manner of death, and federal lawmakers are now asking for another level of review. That is why one sentence inside Warren's interview matters more today than when he originally said it. Because interviews do not exist alone. Eventually, statements meet evidence. Phone records, photos, video metadata, witness accounts, boat locations, messages, forensic findings. That is where memories get tested. And notice something else. The former interrogator is not saying one contradiction solves Nolan's death. At least, it should not be treated that way. A contradiction is a door. An investigator opens it, then sees what is behind it. Maybe confusion, maybe secondhand information, maybe a poorly worded answer, maybe information Warren forgot he learned from somebody else, or maybe something requiring deeper explanation. We do not know yet. That is the responsible position. But there is another section of Warren's interview worth examining, because it may help answer whether this was simple memory compression or whether his account repeatedly shifts between what he personally witnessed and what the group later understood. It starts with the moment Warren says concern finally set in. Back on the mainland, he says somebody mentioned Nolan. Warren asks where he is. Nobody appears to know. He begins contacting people. Then Warren makes a decision that actually works in his favor. He calls Nolan's mother. When she confirms Nolan is not home, Warren contacts the Coast Guard. That behavior deserves acknowledgement. He did not simply remain silent. According to his account and the publicly reported record, a friend contacted the Coast Guard around 11 that night. Warren says he was that friend. But listen carefully to how Warren explains his thinking. He says he understood how dangerous the water could be. People can die there. So he preferred overreacting rather than doing nothing. That raises a subtle question. Not an accusation, a question. If the water was dangerous enough to trigger Coast Guard concern that night, how confident was everyone earlier that Nolan had a safe ride back? Who exactly was supposed to bring him? Did anyone know that person? Did anyone confirm the arrangement? Did Nolan actually make that arrangement himself? That is where the interview needed to get much more precise. Because saying, Nolan was getting another ride, sounds reassuring. Until you ask one more question. With whom? And that is where the next layer of this interview becomes much harder. Because another person's account does not fit neatly beside Warren's. And once you place those accounts together, the issue is no longer whether Warren looked nervous. It becomes whether two versions of Nolan's final known plan can both be true. They cannot both describe the same conversation in the same way. And that is where we need to go next. And that difference is not small. Because according to Ben Crump, the young woman gave another account. Crump says, the boys described Nolan as choosing to remain with her. But according to Crump, the woman said something different. She reportedly said Nolan told her he was going back to the boat. Think about those two statements. I'm staying here with her. And I'm going back to the boat. Those are different intentions. They point in opposite directions. And right now, we do not have enough public evidence to determine which account is accurate. The young woman has not publicly given a detailed interview herself, so we have to be careful here. We are hearing her reported account through Nolan's family and their attorney, but Crump has stated the contradiction publicly, and his wording was unusually direct. They are not saying the same thing. That creates a problem investigators can test, because this is no longer a question about personality. It is not simply, would Nolan leave his friends? Would he stay for a girl? Would he forget about his phone? Those questions involve assumptions. This question does not. What did Nolan actually say? Who heard him say it? Where was he standing? Who was beside him? And what happened immediately afterward? That is where Warren's interview matters, because Warren speaks with certainty about Nolan's decision, not possibility, not uncertainty. He does not say, I assumed Nolan wanted to stay. He does not say, someone later told me he stayed. His explanation is much firmer. Nolan decided to stay. Nolan was with the girl. Nolan was getting another ride. That sounds like direct knowledge. But Warren also says his own final sighting was earlier, so the question becomes unavoidable. What is the source of that certainty? This is exactly the kind of thing the former Army interrogator noticed. Again, his analysis is not evidence. It is not a police conclusion, and it certainly is not proof that Warren committed anything. But his interviewing point is strong. When a person moves from what they personally witnessed to what they apparently know happened later, you stop them. You establish the source. Because otherwise, two different categories of information begin blending together. What Warren saw, what Warren heard, what Warren was told later, and what Warren eventually believed happened. Those four things are not interchangeable. Notice this. Warren's explanation could still be truthful. Maybe somebody beside Nolan heard him say he was staying. Maybe that person told Warren immediately. Maybe Warren heard the conversation himself without physically seeing Nolan. Maybe last saw him at 3 was simply an approximate time. Those possibilities matter. A responsible investigation tests them. It does not turn uncertainty into guilt. But the opposite mistake is dangerous too. You cannot take an unexplained contradiction and simply call it nothing. You resolve it. That is what interviewing is for. And this is where the former interrogator's criticism gets sharper. Because the interview itself was a rare opportunity. Warren was sitting there voluntarily. He was explaining events in detail. He was giving names, locations, actions, reasons. This was the moment to slow the conversation down. Instead of asking another broad question, ask one narrow one. You said 3 o'clock. Did you see Nolan after that? If the answer is no, then how do you know he was beside the boat? If Warren says someone told him, who? If Warren says he heard Nolan, from where? Then you keep going. Did Nolan say he was staying? Or did someone else say that? Did Nolan identify his ride? Did anybody confirm that ride existed? Did the young woman hear this conversation? Did she understand Nolan was staying? Those questions are not hostile. They are basic. And sometimes one precise question does more than 20 emotional ones. Because memory has edges. Either Warren personally witnessed something, or he learned it another way. That distinction can be established. And here is something else. Warren repeatedly emphasizes that the boat problem created urgency. That context is supported. A sea tow call confirms one boat was taking on water. That emergency should not be minimized. When a vessel is taking on water, people focus on the vessel. People move quickly. Plans change. Communication becomes messy. That could explain confusion. But it also creates another issue. If everyone was moving quickly, how carefully was Nolan's plan confirmed? Think about the mechanics for a second. Your group is preparing to leave. One boat has a serious problem. People are moving between vessels. Phones are stored elsewhere. There are thousands of people around. Someone says Nolan is staying. Who takes responsibility for confirming he has transportation? Who actually speaks to him? Not gestures toward him. Not assumes somebody else asked. Who speaks directly to Nolan? And what does Nolan answer? That may ultimately matter more than anybody's interpretation of Warren's face, because investigators can reconstruct communication. They can interview each person separately, then compare the details. Who asked Nolan to board? What exact words were used? How far away was Nolan? Was music playing? Was he drinking? Was the girl beside him? Did she hear the invitation? Did Nolan answer himself? Did somebody answer for him? Did anyone hear him name another boat? And who owned that boat? Those details either begin lining up, or they do not. That is why people often misunderstand what a good interrogation actually does. It does not magically detect lies. It creates testable statements. Then evidence attacks those statements. If 5 witnesses independently remember the same meaningful detail, that matters. If one person remembers something nobody else can place, that matters too. And if somebody changes an answer after learning what others said, that becomes important. But none of those conclusions can responsibly be reached yet, because much of the investigative record is still not public. And that brings us to Warren's strongest defense. His lawyers say he and the other represented friends had nothing to do with Nolan's death. Their attorneys have publicly said the young men cooperated with investigators. They say phone data was provided. They say their clients want answers too. Warren's father even announced a $50,000 reward for information leading to an arrest and conviction connected to Nolan's death. And recently, Warren returned to Horn Island with an attorney. Their stated purpose was to examine the area themselves. You have to include that, because an evidence-led analysis cannot only present facts that make Warren look suspicious. His actions after Nolan disappeared also have to be considered. According to Warren's account, he contacted Nolan's mother. He says he contacted the Coast Guard. His family has publicly offered money for information in the case. His attorneys say he cooperated, and Warren voluntarily gave a lengthy public interview. None of those things proves innocence, but none of them should be erased. This is not a prosecution argument. This is an examination of one question. Did Warren reveal something inside that interview that deserves another look? And I think we can answer that carefully. If slip means, did Warren accidentally confess to harming Nolan? No, there is nothing publicly established that allows us to say that. If slip means, did Warren expose a gap inside his own account? Yes, there is a gap. He places his final sighting around 3 o'clock. Then he speaks with confidence about Nolan's position and decision during the later departure. The missing piece is simple. How did Warren know? That is the slip. Not proof of a crime. A missing bridge in the story. And investigators may already have that bridge. Remember that. The public does not possess the complete case file. Investigators have interviewed dozens of witnesses. They have information we have never seen. So it is entirely possible that this question has been answered privately. But if it has, the public record does not currently make that answer clear. And right now, clarity matters more than ever. Because the official investigation has entered a much more serious stage. The state autopsy has been completed, but the district attorney has said the report will remain withheld while the case is presented for grand jury review. That does not mean the grand jury will indict anyone. It does not mean prosecutors have determined a crime occurred. A grand jury can review evidence without the public knowing every detail. That process itself should not be turned into speculation. What we can say is this. The independent autopsy commissioned by Nolan's family did not determine his cause or manner of death. That examination also had limitations. The pathologist received Nolan's body after the initial autopsy. Decomposition was significant. Certain organs and structures were unavailable for examination. Because of that, the independent pathologist identified questions that still required answers. So we are left with 2 separate investigations. What caused Nolan's death? And what happened before he entered that water? Those questions overlap, but they are not identical. Even if a final medical finding eventually identifies drowning, that alone would not explain how Nolan entered the water. Accident? Medical event? Intoxication? An attempt to swim somewhere? Another circumstance? Those possibilities require evidence. Likewise, if investigators discover a confrontation occurred, that alone would not automatically establish what caused Nolan's death. Separate the questions. That is how you avoid building a theory backward. And the phone could become important here. Not because a phone magically solves everything, but because digital evidence can anchor human memory. Messages have times. Calls have times. Photos have metadata. Applications may store activity. Cloud accounts may preserve information that is no longer visible locally. Location records may provide context. And communications may tell investigators what Nolan believed he was doing. That is why the current dispute over examining the phone matters. As of August 14th, the family's legal team says it remains willing to allow a jointly coordinated forensic examination. They say an agreement was reached earlier to involve experts from both sides. Possible FBI participation was also discussed, but the family says the exact forensic protocol was never finalized. Chain of custody, scope of extraction, who receives the data, how the extraction is preserved. When the device is returned, those sound procedural. They are not minor. Digital evidence needs a defensible chain of custody. Otherwise, every later disagreement becomes, who handled it? What changed? What was copied? What was preserved? So the phone is not just an object in this case anymore. It may become a test of Nolan's communications, a test of witness recollections, potentially a test of what people knew and when. What would you want examined first? The messages, location data, deleted material, photographs, call logs? Because whichever direction that evidence points, it needs to be followed consistently. Toward Warren, away from Warren, toward somebody else, or toward an accident. Evidence does not owe anyone their preferred ending. And there is another development we cannot ignore. Members of the Congressional Black Caucus have formally asked the United States Justice Department for an independent federal review. Their letter asks the department to examine the circumstances surrounding Nolan's disappearance and death and determine whether a federal investigation is warranted. The letter specifically says federal involvement should not prejudge the outcome. That language matters. A federal review is not confirmation that local investigators did something wrong. It is not confirmation that a federal crime occurred. And it is not evidence against Warren or anyone else. It means lawmakers believe there are enough unanswered questions to justify another level of scrutiny. The Justice Department has confirmed that appropriate personnel are reviewing the request. And according to reporting, the FBI has already been assisting local investigators in some capacity. So consider where this stands now. A state investigation remains active. The official autopsy remains unreleased. A grand jury is expected to review investigative material. The family wants federal scrutiny. The phone still requires a coordinated forensic examination, and nobody has been charged with causing Nolan's death. Warren Hudson has not been charged. He has not been convicted of anything, and publicly labeling him a killer would go beyond the evidence. That matters even more now because Warren and other friends say they have received threats. Some have created a legal defense fund. Their attorneys have warned against defamatory accusations. Whatever you believe about this case, threatening witnesses does not uncover truth. Harassing families does not create evidence. And online certainty is not forensic work. If anything, it can make a real investigation harder. Witnesses become afraid to speak. Rumors contaminate recollections. False information gets repeated until people remember the rumor instead of the original event. That is exactly why we stay with documented contradictions. And there is one contradiction that remains at the center. Nolan's friends say he chose to remain behind. According to Ben Crump, the young woman says Nolan indicated he was returning to the boat. Notice this. Those accounts do not require body language analysis. They require corroboration. Find the witnesses. Find the communications. Identify the boats. Establish who remained. Establish who departed. Determine whether Nolan had another confirmed ride. and identify the last person who can independently place him alive. That is how this moves forward. Not by deciding first that Warren must be lying, and not by deciding first that Warren must be telling the truth. You take Warren's interview and try to break it. That is what investigators do with an important witness account. Not because the witness is guilty, because a reliable story should survive precise questions. Where were you? Who were you with? What could you see? What could you hear? How do you know that? Who told you? When? Then ask it again differently. Compare it with the others. Compare it with the phone. Compare it with photographs. Compare it with boat records. Compare it with surveillance. Compare it with forensic evidence. And wherever the story changes, you stop. You ask why. That is the lesson inside the ex-interrogator's analysis. The most important moment was not Warren becoming emotional. It was not his posture. It was not his eyes. It was a transition in knowledge. From the last time I saw Nolan to Nolan decided to stay. That transition needs a source. Maybe investigators already have one. Maybe another witness supplied it. Maybe Warren simply explained himself poorly. But until that bridge is clear, the question remains legitimate. How did Warren know? And Nolan's family has been consistent about what they want from this process. Answers. Not internet punishment. Not rumors. Answers they can trust. His father has explained the rule Nolan grew up hearing. If you leave with a group, you return with that group. His mother has said she could not accept being told not to worry about her son. And now Nolan's 19th birthday is approaching without him. His mother said this week, "Our lives have forever changed. This new normal is something I would never wish on anyone." That is where this story belongs. Not with Warren. Not with commentators. Not with us. With Nolan, an 18-year-old young man whose family still cannot say exactly how his life ended. And until that answer exists, every witness deserves fair scrutiny. Every piece of evidence deserves preservation. Every contradiction deserves examination. And every person involved deserves the presumption the evidence actually supports. We will keep following this case as those answers become public. Not rumors. Not fake arrests. Not anonymous accusations. Evidence. If new forensic findings emerge, if the phone is examined, if the grand jury acts, or if federal investigators step further in, we will separate what is confirmed from what people merely claim. Because 1 month later, the central question has not changed. Nolan cannot tell investigators what he intended to do, so the people who were there have to reconstruct it for him. Now that you have heard Warren's own account, and the contradiction identified inside it, what stands out to you most? Did Warren simply compress a chaotic sequence of events, or did his own words reveal knowledge he still needs to explain?